I couldn't be more excited to welcome our keynote speaker, who is one of the foremost scholars on international conflict and polarization. Rachel Kleinfeld is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the founding CEO of the Truman National Security Project. She advises governments, philanthropists, and activists on how democracies make major social change, with a particular focus on improving troubled democracies both around the globe and here at home. Early in our own research on polarization and successful interventions, Rachel helped us recognize how some of the most successful interventions, especially internationally, have focused on reducing the salience of political identity and helping people recognize common identities they share with others. I'm incredibly eager to learn more from her. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Kleinfeld.
So as the governor mentioned, I study international conflict and democracies that are in really serious trouble. So when they wheel me out to keynote a conference, it's bad news. You actually don't want to see me at your conference. And I think that's about where we are right now. I mean, it's really easy to be sanguine about democracy in America. After all, we're a really old country. We've weathered hard times before. We've had our ups and downs, but we're the oldest democracy in the world. We just shouldn't get too worked up about the present moment. And some of that is true. America's exceptional in a lot of ways. And some of those ways are really, really helpful. We've got old, deeply established democratic traditions. Other ways are less helpful. For instance, our democratic system is so old that a lot of things that we assume are laws are in fact just habits and norms. Now, norms can be stronger than laws. But when they break, it's much harder to reestablish them. They're really fiendishly difficult to restore. And a disintegration of norms is what America's been facing for the last 15 years. So I just want to show you a gander of how scholars are looking at American democracy. If you look at the Varieties of Democracies Index, it's a big international index. Since 2010, America's been backsliding. Economist Intelligence Unit, the Economist magazine is kind of the Bible for those of us who work internationally. It downgraded the United States to a flawed democracy in 2017. Europe's International Idea calls us a backsliding democracy in their classification system. Freedom House, where I sit on the board, it's a very bipartisan board. It showed the United States on one of the fastest downward trajectories of any country in the world over the last few years. We're now rated between Romania and Croatia in our democratic system. And it's not just our democracy ratings. If you look at rule of law ratings like the World Justice Project, we're nowhere near our high income consolidated democratic peers in the rule of law anymore. We've fallen down the ranks. Economic freedom, if you look at the Fraser Economic Institute, economic freedom charts along with democracy, and again, we're falling below our peers. And part of that's because trust is falling. America used to be the highest trust country in the world. Now there are some sub-Saharan African countries and former countries of the Soviet Union that rank above us. And when trust falls, you lose a lot of things. You lose GDP, that's very highly correlated with trust. Crime rises, corruption tends to rise, inequality rises, violence rises. Trust is a really important norm that you don't want to lose. Now, you could say these are all egghead statistics and, we academics sit in our ivory tower, but let me just say, these things are moving into the real world and we're feeling them. So members of Congress, threats against them have risen tenfold from 2016 to 2021. Federal judges, those threats have almost doubled since 2016. 15% of local elected officials, these are school board members and county commissioners and so on, 15% got threats last year if you look at national surveys. If you look at particular hotspots like San Diego, 75% of San Diego local officials reported threats and harassment, and of those who got that, more than half are considering leaving public service. In other consolidated democracies, if someone runs their car into a group of peaceful protesters, they're a foreign terrorist. In America, that's happened 150 times since 2017. So I study political violence and democracy all over the world. I'm on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy and of Freedom House. And This is serious. This is not where you want our country to be. We're not facing numbers like Kenya in 2007, but what we're facing are small business owners being shot because they have a pride flag outside their door, or a man in Ohio shooting his neighbor because he mistakenly thought he was a Democrat. This is the country where, in my home state, I live in New Mexico, a disgruntled legislator shot up the homes of 4 other elected officials, including the house where one of them's 8-year-old daughter was sleeping, and the debris fell on her as she slept. That's where we are right now as a country. Who runs for office under conditions like these? Who's going to uphold our democracy? You know that it should take moral courage to be in the positions that you're in as governors, those of you who are state legislators, but it really shouldn't take physical courage. That should not be what it requires to run for office in our country, and yet that's not what we're asking of our school board members. So I can talk about what got us here, but I only have 10 minutes left. So I have a paper out that I think is on your QR code resource listing that summarizes the last 20 years of research on polarization and tries to give you a sense of what's going on in the country. What it says in a nutshell, Americans are actually not that ideologically polarized. As you just heard, we have big gaps on perception, but there's actually a lot of agreement. Affectively, emotionally, we are very polarized. We really do dislike each other a lot, and a lot of that is also misperception. But the odd thing is, other countries in Europe, for instance, also have high levels of affective polarization, even as high as ours, and they're not facing this kind of democratic degradation that we're seeing here. What we have in America that's uniquely problematic is that we're in a situation called pernicious polarization. Jennifer McCoy and Marat Summer, some colleagues of mine, coined that term. What it means is polarization has become a political strategy. So this isn't just that people dislike each other, and it's not just that politicians disagree ideologically. We've had both of those actually for quite a long time. But when polarization becomes a winning political strategy, democracies fail. My colleagues who have looked at this around the world since 1950 found that of countries that have been perniciously polarized, no country has been as perniciously polarized as long as the United States. We're in totally uncharted waters. And of those that had become, the less developed democracies generally that had become perniciously polarized, the majority degraded. Of the majority that degraded, 23 of 26 lost their democracies altogether. Now, we're not quite that far, and that's good because it's easier to reverse it when we're not quite that far. And there are many, many Americans, you're hearing from them today, the panel this morning, who are dedicating their lives to changing this situation. There's an exhausted majority that desperately wants something different. And there's tens of thousands of your constituents who are really putting their hearts and souls into creating a different America here. But a study looking at international peace building found this: programming that focuses on individual personal change, but that never links or translates that action into socio-political change, has no discernible effects on peace. None. All that hard work for nothing. And why? It's because when polarization becomes a political strategy, it takes politicians to unravel it. All these good people are doing incredibly important work trying to weave the country together. They can't succeed if the politicians are unraveling it every night. And so we need you to be role models, as Sean Westwood was just saying. The governors in this room have enormous power. It's really hard to overstate how much the research shows that people look to the governors, to our nation's politicians, as leaders of their identity group, of their party group, and they say, what's acceptable? What should I do? So I want to end with 3 ideas for what you can do as role models, and then 2 ideas for what you can do as executives that are things that you can really act on in your home states. So first, just a baseline, we need to make violence abnormal again in this country. That means not in jokes. Jokes have this way of getting around our rational thoughts, the things that you wouldn't accept in your regular discourse. People kind of laugh at, they pass on memes and pictures and jokes. So violence has to be abnormal in jokes, in memes, in implicit suggestions, in postcards of your family at Christmas. You know, the pictures that went around at Christmas time of various leaders with guns. Now, it's not a statement against guns. I grew up in Alaska. I was raised by libertarians, which are as close to wolves as you can get. And our Jewish faith is different than the Upper West Side Jewish faith. We had a gun cabinet in my basement, and we actually had gun making equipment in the basement. But guns in Alaska are for moose hunting. Guns in political postcards are not. There's a normalization, and we need to denormalize it. Second, as Governor Cox was saying earlier, people need to understand that to be party members of your party in good standing, they don't actually have to hate the other side. They can like their policies instead, their own policies. So you have to give them the permission to have strong ideological beliefs without hate. That's what these beautiful ads are doing that the governors are making, thanks to Governor Cox. You can remind people that they have a shared identity, that they have a common identity as Mainers or Tennesseans, rather than as their political party. Really important to make that state identity or another identity, mothers, fathers, dog owners, their salient one. The last point on how you can use rhetoric and role modeling to make change, we need to return to the idea that one side does not pose an existential threat to democracy. There's good research, this Stanford study that's come up a couple of times, it looked at over 30,000 people, and they found the most important intervention you can make that changed not only feelings toward the other party, because feelings are very changeable, as you've heard, they can come up and down within a week, but actual behavior toward the other party is a sense that the other party wants to destroy our democracy, so we'd better act first. If they're gonna do it, we should get ahead of them. That is incredibly destructive. And so not giving people that fear that the other side is bent on subverting democracy is really important. And you can model it, and you can act on it, and you can show that there are ways to work together. The other side are not our existential enemies. They're just people with whom we disagree, sometimes strongly. Now, for the last two suggestions, I want to turn to your role as executives and leaders, both in your party and in your government. On the party side, most people who study polarization look at the American public and they say, oh my God, look at the statistics on the American public. You just heard a bunch of them from More in Common and from Sean Westwood about just how polarized Americans are. But if you look at other studies, regular Americans are actually followers of politicians. The political polarization in our country started at the political level, and it really started with candidate selection. What we've seen is that for well over a decade, moderates are opting out of running because they see that they're not getting selected, or they just see that that party is probably not going to pick them. They're not going to make it through the primaries. And so one thing you can do as governors who often have very strong roles in your home parties is to try to select moderates, give them fundraising help, tell funders about them, help them make those positive campaign ads and teach them how that works. The importance of self-reporting of state legislators who say, I'm a moderate and I'm just not going to make it through that gauntlet, so I'm not going to try to get any higher, is quite high. And so since you play this outsized role, you can play an outsized role in bringing these moderates into politics. And what we know from our current age, but also from the Gilded Age, which was the last time we had polarization like this, is that changing people is one of the best ways to change polarization. You need to get moderates into power. Second point on the things you can do as executives, but my last point about the things you can do, is that you're your state's executive, and accountability works. Our polarization is leading all the way to threats and violence, as I started out with. And those threats and violence are affecting who runs, who wants to take part in office. It's more, by the way, at the national level, we're seeing more against Republicans from other Republicans. At the city level, that San Diego study, it's against moderates, some of whom are likely to be Republicans. But it's affecting who runs. And it's really affecting parents with kids because the threats are coming against their kids. And we can't have a country like that. And you can do something about it because governors control law enforcement. So as governors, you play a huge role in determining whose side people think the state is on. When we look internationally, there are studies in Israel and Germany and the US and so on, we see that political violence goes up when people think they'll have impunity, when people think that they will not be punished so severely for their crimes, it rises. And so if you can show that your state's law enforcement takes threats seriously, we're seeing threats now, not just against officials, by the way, we're seeing them against arts organizations. We're seeing them against get out the vote organizations. People who have no ability to really protect themselves. It's very widespread. Some of those are not what's called true threats in law enforcement, but law enforcement can still do what's called a knock and talk. They can knock on the door and say, hey, threats, not a great idea, here I am. So teaching your police, teaching your state police how to deal with these things, how to de-escalate conflict in protests when we're having protesters and counter-protesters, how to police armed rallies, how to remove law enforcement who have become extremists. There are organizations that can do all of that and that can help you with that. There's a group called ICAP, there's a group called States United that can really help your state's law enforcement learn how to legally enforce accountability so that the legal activities of First Amendment speech are protected and incitement and violence go down in the country. Now, this is not going to be easy. It's going to mean speaking up against your own side, because one of the things the research says is that if Democrats wag a finger at Republicans or Republicans wag a finger at Democrats, nobody cares. You have to talk about your own side. That's what actually gets people's attention. And that can be scary. It can be physically scary, given what I've just said about the number of threats people are getting. So there's power in numbers. There's power in celebrity, in bringing people who have power within your in-group, you know, country music stars in Tennessee, sports stars in your state, small business owners. Small business is one of the last vestiges of strong levels of trust in America. The military and small business have the most trust of any groups in America. These are the groups you can gather around you to say, you know what? There are rules in our society, there are norms in our society, and we don't stand for violence. We don't stand for disagreement that gets to that point. We can do better as a country. And I think as you get into this space and you learn how to disagree better, you will find that it takes courage, but it also is an incredible reward, because it means that the country can move forward and get stuff done. And there's nobody who likes to get stuff done more than I hear our nation's governors. So it's an exciting moment. I want to leave you with this. You can't make this stuff up. My 8-year-old daughter is literally on Friday, she's been doing a class civics project, and on Friday she has to stand in front of her whole school and give a speech on how to be a good citizen. And she's terrified of standing up in front of all these people and talking about how to be a good citizen. And I ask you to find more courage than even she is going to show, because it's going to take courage to do this role modeling. It's going to take courage to speak to your state law enforcement. It's going to take courage to speak to your state party chairs about who could win in your state. But if we do those things, there is no one who has more power than our nation's governors to change the direction of our country. And we need that change of direction. Thank you very much.